Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of The Curious Cat. Thought I'd answer a quick question in today's video. I had a friend of mine ask a question about Bitcoin, or a few questions actually, just about the network and all that. So I thought I'd read the question and give my thoughts on it here in today's video. So I hope you guys enjoy. If you do, please hit like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and as always, stay prosperous out there and do your best to thrive in these trying times. So here we have Nate asking, how is Bitcoin safer? So Bitcoin is safer because of the decentralized nature and basically the amount of computing power that is dedicated to the network. So Bitcoin has the most amount of computing power dedicated to its safety and security than any other network in the entire world. And these computers that maintain the network and keep it safe and secure are actually scattered across the world. So they're not centralized. So they're not at the mercy of one centralized power. And if you look at traditional banking, of course, they have their own servers that maintain their network, but they are centralized and there's only so many of them. There's maybe 10 or 15 of these computers that maintain their network, whereas Bitcoin has thousands of computers that are scattered across the entire globe. So it's very safe in that sense. And it's the computing power that's dedicated to Bitcoin is far greater than any other cause in the world. So that's how it's safer. It's safe in the fact that all transactions are verified by each computer on the network. So there's no way to fake a transaction or to counterfeit a Bitcoin. So it's safe in that sense, where if a transaction happens, we can guarantee that the transaction happened and that the Bitcoin is in fact legit and it's not counterfeit. So that's some of the ways that it's safer. And then the next question is, how is it more reliable? So it's more reliable because we know through the computer programming and the fact that we can all, if you're so inclined, you could read the whole program of Bitcoin and how it's working. And we know that there's only 21 million. So it has a very limited supply. It's the only thing in the world that actually has a definite supply. Every other currency in the world is always inflating. And right now in today's environment, we have the governments printing record amounts of currency and flooding the markets with pretty much every government in the world right now is flooding their countries with their government currency. So it's not very reliable when people are constantly debasing the currency. Whereas Bitcoin, we know that it has a definite supply and that it can never be debased in that sense. It can never be inflated away. We know the inflation schedule because it's part of the program, the protocol that Bitcoin operates on. So that's how it's more reliable. It's not at the mercy of a third party. It's decentralized, and so that offers a lot of reliability, in my opinion. And the next question Nate asks is, how do we know it hasn't been infiltrated by the World Bank, global elites, since there is no way of tracking who owns which coin? So that's a bit of a false belief or narrative that it can't be traced. Bitcoin is actually one of the most traceable currencies in the world because the blockchain essentially holds every transaction. It records every transaction that's ever happened on the network. So it's actually highly traceable. If you are really tech savvy and you really know what you're doing, there is ways that people can cover up their tracks and make it hard to track who owns what. But for the large part, Bitcoin is highly traceable, and not very few people actually know how to properly hide their footprint. So it would be very tricky for these world banks to own a lot of Bitcoin and to be buying it in large amounts without kind of the general public knowing. So of course it is possible, and it wouldn't surprise me if they do own little bits of Bitcoin. Who knows how much? But I think it's not that likely, because when it first came out, it really threatens the traditional banking system. So if you're a big business and you're making tons of money, you don't really want to be investing in a technology that makes your business model obsolete. So I guess, it could be a big exit plan by these world banks if they kind of knew that they were going to collapse the economy and that the traditional banking system would be in jeopardy. Then maybe they had a part in creating this. I think it's unlikely, but it is possible. And in that sense, maybe they kind of had a plan, and they needed somewhere to park their capital or to move their capital if they knew they were going to destroy the currency. So I think it is possible that they own it, but again, it's because of its decentralized nature. Even if they do own some, I've been in the space for quite a long time, and I follow a lot of the big advocates of Bitcoin. And so I know a lot of people that are in the space, and they're definitely not bankers. The majority of people in the Bitcoin space aren't a fan of what the banking cartel has been doing to the currencies and a lot of the large holders of Bitcoin are more libertarian and kind of free market capitalists. So we know that for sure if you kind of start doing your research about who owns a lot of the Bitcoin. Of course, we don't know everyone who owns Bitcoin, but we do know a lot of the large holders if you're in the space long enough, and a lot of them definitely aren't banking type. A lot of the people are actually kind of nerdy programmers that got involved in the programming side of it, and then we have a lot of libertarians or anarcho-capitalists that are involved because of their belief in a kind of lessening the power that governments have and distributing the power and basically offering us more liberty. So I think it's unlikely that the central banks have large positions in Bitcoin. So of course it is possible, but I don't think it's highly likely. And the second that any of that information slips out, then I think there'll be a mad rush to Bitcoin. And even if they did own it, it wouldn't really matter, because we all have we all have the freedom to buy some Bitcoin. And so even if they did own large portions, it wouldn't really matter. We can all still buy and own part of the network. And so the more people that come over to the Bitcoin side, the more the price goes up. And so it doesn't really matter if there's if they do own some. And so his last question here is, can this currency, like any other, not be manipulated by those who are in possession of large amounts? So in a way, yes, it can be manipulated in a sense where they can orchestrate major sell-offs, but they have to be careful. They don't, of course, when you're selling your Bitcoin, if this is the currency of the future, you have to be careful, because if you sell off a bunch of your currency and you kind of plan this orchestrated sell-off, you have to be careful that there's not another large entity that comes in and buys it all up and runs the price up, and then you essentially you got rid of a lot of your holdings. So they have to be very careful. And I have seen what looks, I wouldn't even call it manipulation. It is free market capitalism. The closest thing we have, it basically is free market, in my opinion. And so they have the right to sell off their holdings if they wish. And so I wouldn't call it manipulation. I think some of the exchanges do manipulate the prices just through the buy and sell orders and kind of jumping in line on some of that stuff. So there is some manipulation, but the manipulation that we see in that, I would say, is a lot less, in the sense of they're not able to manipulate it through debasement of the currency. So they can't manipulate it like these fiat currencies where they just come in and double the money supply, therefore cutting the purchasing power of those dollars in half. So they can't manipulate it in that sense. They can't manipulate it in the sense of messing with interest rates. So, you know, when everyone's all maxed out on debt in these government currencies, and the governments come in and jack interest rates or whatever they might do, well, that puts a lot of pressure on the market, and they can kind of control or manipulate what happens with the value of these currencies by playing with interest rates and by printing and messing with the currency supplies. So they can't do that with Bitcoin. It's a fixed supply, like I've mentioned, but they can, to some extent, manipulate it just through large sell-offs, try and spook the market, spook a lot of the investors to trick them into selling, causing fear in the market, so the people sell, and then the large players will come back in and buy at the new lows. So I do think that's happening, but if you realize that's happening, basically I was burned with that when I first got into the market. I sold at a major panic in 2017. I sold a lot of my Bitcoin, and I learned my lesson. I lost about half of my Bitcoin through the end of all that. And so it's just a learning lesson that probably many go through in this space. But what I learned from that in the end is that anytime I've sold Bitcoin, I've regretted it. And so now my tactic is to just buy and hold, buy and hold. And if you're buying and holding for say 5 or 10 years out, it really doesn't matter if these people are manipulating the price through orchestrated sell-offs of their large holdings. As long as you hold on to your Bitcoin and you don't get spooked in these situations, and you're not investing money that you can't afford to lose or that you might need access to right away, then you can afford to kind of just hold on to your Bitcoin and ride it out. Because if you look at the overall trend, Bitcoin is always going up. And if we look at 5 or 10 years down the road, there is a high possibility that the price is going to be much higher just because of what's going on in traditional currency markets. So yes, I do think it's somewhat, I don't even know if I'd call it manipulation, but it is, well, there is some manipulation. Like I said, I think more through the exchanges and that, but an orchestrated sell-off isn't even necessarily manipulation. It's not manipulated like traditional markets, like ETF markets, in the prices of gold and silver, where they create a bunch of derivatives that they can rehypothecate these underlying assets and sell the same asset. They can sell the same ounce of gold to estimated up to about 50 people own that same ounce of gold. And so when there's all this increased demand for gold, they just sell you a paper version of that gold. And they say, oh, you want some gold? Here, buy this ETF. So you're buying a little, digital representation of the underlying asset, but they sell that same representation of the physical ounce 50 times over. So that's how they really manipulate the price of something like gold. They can't do that with Bitcoin. So that's the beauty of Bitcoin. It's not manipulated in the traditional sense. And like I say, of course, I think there's orchestrated sell-offs, but just as we all get a little wiser with our investing and that, hopefully we're just buying and holding and waiting to see this major price increase that's most likely coming in 5 or 10 years down the road, where I think Bitcoin is going to be worth a lot more money. But that's of course, none of this is investment advice. These are just my thoughts. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope that makes sense to you guys, and have a fantastic day wherever you are, and we'll see you in the next video.